Hello, in this series of videos we're going to be looking at Protestant missions in China to 1949, focusing on the themes of conflict and change. And this is, I think, a very difficult kind of period to understand. It's something I'm often trying to kind of struggle with to make sense of in a way that I can deliver you a lecture that is not too hard to follow, because there's a lot going on here. But if we think about what's going on with China and Protestant Christianity, it begins, like in Korea, in the 19th century. Right? Christianity in its Protestant form is going to come to China in the 19th century, so they're a couple hundred years behind Catholicism. We talked about the Catholics before. I don't want to talk, won't go into a whole lot of detail here. We'll talk more about them in another series of lectures. But they're still there. They are mostly attempting to survive. That's kind of thing. They're trying to hang on. They will grow, but they're not going to be able, eventually Protestant Christians will be able to outstrip Catholics for a variety of reasons that we're not going to go into. But the key thing is, I don't really think the Catholics just go away. They're still there. They're attempting to survive. The Protestants in the early 19th century, they want to enter, right? They want to get into Korea, or get into China. But the Qing dynasty, which is really, really complex. I could go on and on forever because I teach a whole class on China. But that's basically the rulers of China don't want the Protestants to come in. Right? They already had Catholics. We talked about how they had trouble with Catholics and Catholicism, and there was some issues, especially about ancestor rights. They don't want to have more people come in that could also cause trouble from their perspective. However, the industrial power of Western nations eventually is able to overcome them. There is going to be wars fought, and it's very complex because the primary issue of some wars that are going to be fought in China in the mid-19th century is over the issue of opium. Basically, the Chinese government wanted to keep imported opium out of China, and there was a large number of Westerners who wanted to be able to bring it into China. Also, Westerners who didn't want it, who thought it was a bad thing to, basically sell people a highly addictive drug. But essentially what happens, there's these wars fought over opium. The Western countries will win these wars because they have more advanced technology. And this will eventually lead to treaties being signed that will allow missionaries to work in China in particular areas. And these are usually at first the poor areas. Again, trying to keep things streamlined. Over time, they'll be expanded so that missionaries can go wherever they want in China. But in this early part in the mid-19th century, the wars that the Western countries win because of their advanced technology are going to lead to China having to sign treaties that will allow missionaries some limited access into China, especially into the port areas, the areas where Western ships come and go. Now, usually Westerners aren't supposed to go out of the ports, or they're not supposed to go very far. But the key thing is here, Protestant Christian missionaries are going to be able to work in China legally and try and convert people to Christianity, and they have some limited success. And we're going to focus not so much on the success. Here we're talking a lot about conflict and how I want us to try and think about this idea of how do Chinese try and make Christianity their own, and what kind of tensions can that raise. And that brings us to this thing called the Taiping Rebellion. So again, that's one of the things we're thinking about, this issue of conflict and change. And this kind of conflict is going to be about, there's lots of different conflicts, but a lot of it is, what does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to be a Chinese Christian? And does it even make sense to say, there's this kind of Christianity, there's this other kind of Christianity. Isn't there just Christianity, right? That's something that people kind of struggle with. So it begins with this guy named Hong Xiuquan. And Hong Xiuquan was a scholar. He wanted to be able to pass the exams. If you could pass this series of exams on the teachings of Confucius in China, you could get a job as a government official. It's the best thing ever in China at the time. Right? You want to be able to pass the exams. Being a government official is great. Get a nice job. There's certain taxes you don't have to pay. It's a really good deal. And one thing I just wanted to know, Hong Xiuquan is an ethnic minority. He was a Hakka. The majority group in China are the Han. There are lots of other minorities. One is called the Hakka. In many ways, just in terms of people's faces and bodies, they look very similar to the Han, but they have slightly different customs and might speak a different language. But for our purposes here, I just want to note they are an ethnic minority group. And here's the thing about Hong Xiuquan. Hong Xiuquan took and failed the exams multiple times. This guy had like the worst case of test anxiety ever. He was continuously taking and failing the exams. And you want to be able to pass these exams because they will help you to become a government official. Now, usually when you took the exams, you would have to go to a big city to take them. They didn't come to you. You had to go to a big city. And guess what? A lot of the big cities that had the exams were treaty ports. So there were missionaries there. And the missionaries knew when an exam was going on, and they would go out and hand out what were called tracts. Tracts are like little pamphlets that explain different ideas. And missionaries often gave these out in hopes of converting someone, right? It's hard to have a conversation with someone in a busy city. People have a place to go, but you can give them a piece of paper and hope that they'll read it later. And when Hong Xiuquan was going to take and fail one of these exams, he is going to receive one of those pieces of paper. And at the time, he just basically, and I want to point out, it's just not one piece of paper. It's he actually receives kind of a set, fairly big amount of literature. And what happens is he goes and he fails the exam again, goes home with the tracts, and has a nervous breakdown. And goes, and this gets complex how we describe this, but we'll say for our purposes, he basically goes unconscious for a period of time. And during this time, he has a series of experiences that he will come to understand as visions. And that's what this is meant to illustrate here. This is meant to illustrate his visions, what he took to be visions. And he came out of this, woke up, regained consciousness, and he was trying to understand his visions. Well, one of his cousins had read the materials that he had received from the missionary. And he said, I think you need to read these. These might help you to understand your visions, right? These might help you to understand your visions. You need to read them. And so he does do that. And he becomes convinced of several things. And this image, I think, does a pretty good job of showing that in many respects. So one thing that he has a vision of, and we'll just, I'll come back to that momentarily. He becomes convinced that Confucianism is bad, that Confucianism has led China the wrong way because it doesn't lead to the God that's described in these tracts. Right. So in his vision, he saw an old man being yelled at by an older man, and he came to identify the really old man as God and the younger man as Confucius. So he said, okay, God is angry at Confucius because Confucius has led us astray through things like ancestor rights. So, and this kind of makes sense if we understand this in a purely secular way. This guy has been failing the Confucian exams forever, and now he has this access to these religious ideas that say Confucius was not the greatest guy in the world, and that we should follow his teachings, but rather his teachings have led us astray. So we can understand why that might be attractive to him. And you can see him there in this vision falling down and worshiping God. So he becomes convinced that these are visions that he needs to interpret. And one thing that he becomes convinced of is that he is the second son of God, that he is the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And there's a wonderful book written about this subject called God's Chinese Son. So as he reads this, and through his visions, what happens is one of his visions, he is approached by the same old man who gives Confucius a hard time. And then there's a younger man with him. And the old man says, I'm your father, and this is your older brother. And then later on, through studying these tracts, he becomes convinced that the old man is God, the younger, or God the Father, the younger man, his older brother, is Jesus. So he says, well, I must be the second son of Jesus. I'm God's son as well. I'm just the younger brother, not the older brother. So this is interesting. This goes to this question of what is Chinese Christianity? What is Christianity in a sense? Because if you're a traditional Christian, this is a little bit different. You don't usually think of God having two sons, right? It brings into question monotheism. But in any case, what's also important is that Hong Xiuquan notices something. One thing that the missionaries really emphasize is idolatry. They don't like idolatry. They see it everywhere in China. Right? Remember, idolatry is this idea that you put something else before God. You worship gods other than the one God. And remember, in China, there's ancestor rites, there's worship of different gods. This is something that's very normal in China. And so Hong Xiuquan thinks that's really bad, but he notices something. So you got to stick with me here. I maybe don't study Chinese, but just stick with me here. So the word for emperor in China, the person who rules China is Huangdi. Right? You can see there, Huangdi. That's the Chinese. The traditional, and remember this was an issue for Catholics, was how do we translate God into Chinese? And one idea was to use a traditional word for God, the Lord on high, which is Shangdi. Now, one thing you'll notice is that these have the same character, right? D is, you notice, it's the same shape. And this means a kind of divinity. And so what happened is Hong Xiuquan said, look, the emperors are really bad. They are taking God's divine identity, which does not belong to them. They're not divine. Only God is divine. And here you've got these emperors trying to usurp God's position, right? There's only one God, the Lord on high. And here you see this emperor trying to steal that. And one thing I should point out, when there was an emperor, you weren't supposed to use one of, like if there was an emperor, I'm just going to say, let's see, I'm sorry, just trying to think of the Hongla emperor. Like there's a Hongla emperor. If there's a Hongla emperor, you're not supposed to name your kid with a character Hong or La, out of respect for the emperor, right? Okay, we're being ruled by the Hongla emperor. Your kid cannot have the sound Hong or the sound La in his name while the emperor's around. Can't do that. So this is a big deal, right? This is really bad from Hong Xiuquan's perspective. God is being usurped. So Hong Xiuquan at first just kind of acts in his local area and goes around destroying statues of Confucius and Buddhas and things like that. That's iconoclasm. If you've never heard the word iconoclasm, it comes from, basically there was this controversy in Eastern Christianity after the rise of Islam, whether maybe we shouldn't have images, right? There's a question, why do we have images? Is that a kind of idolatry? And the people who wanted to destroy those images were called icons, and the iconoclasm means the destruction of the icon. So there were Christians who said we shouldn't have images, let's destroy them. And those people lost out generally within Eastern Christianity. Now they're famous for their icons. But when you have iconoclasm, that means literally it's the destruction of images. It can mean attacks on any important ideas. So Hong Xiuquan goes around breaking stuff in his area. And in the 19th century, things are not going well for China. China is really falling apart. And because of that, what happens is there's all this social disorder. There's bandits, but the government's not around to protect you from bandits. So Hong Xiuquan and his Hakka ethnic group, this ethnic minority, form a militia, and many of them convert to his religion. So we've got this militia trying to defend the local community based around their ethnicity. Most of them are Hakka, and based around this new religion that, or new understanding of Christianity that Hong Xiuquan is propagating. The militia will clash with government troops. The Qing dynasty that rules China will clash with those troops. Basically what happens is troops move in and say, hey, you can't have a militia. That's dangerous to the government. We're the army. We don't need you to be around to help us. And the Hong Xiuquan's militia says, yeah, but you'll leave eventually and the bandits will come back. So no, we're not standing down. And so what happens is this leads to fighting between the militia and the government troops. And the militia wins. And so Hong Xiuquan says, well, you know what? The Manchu are evil. I'm sorry. Well, okay, I'll come back to that. So the Hong Xiuquan says, well, I'm God's second son. God wants me to get us away from the teachings of Confucius, the teachings of Buddha, and all these other things. I'm just going to declare a new dynasty and overthrow the government. That's what I'm going to do. And what's also important, I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible. Remember I said the vast majority of people in China are Han. That's an ethnic group. The Hong Xiuquan is from an ethnic minority, the Hakka. what happened is the Qing dynasty, the government, is actually not run by the Han or the Hakka. It's run by a third group called the Manchus. They were people from the north who came down and conquered China. And so they're an ethnic minority ruling China. And a lot of Han Chinese do not particularly like that. And that number is going to be increasing. And so what happens is there's also an ethnic element here where this Hakka leader also feels some of the frustration that the Han feel and says, those Manchus, they came down and attacked us. They're evil. They do terrible things. And in one of Hong Xiuquan's visions, he saw the Manchu as demons. And God gave him a sword and told him to kill demons. So he says, okay, the demons are the Manchu. The ruler, the emperor who has usurped God's identity by calling himself Huangdi, he is a demon. We need to get rid of these people. So what's going to happen is Hong Xiuquan is going to go out with his militia and conquer huge amounts of territory. His army will expand. Many people will like his religion or like aspects of it, or just say, we want to be on the winning team, and will join him. And they will actually go so far as to seize the old capital of China, Nanjing, which is here. But you can see they have control a huge part of China, including some of the most wealthiest areas. And the key thing that's holding this rebellion together is this belief that we've got the second son of Jesus here, who has a connection with God. Now, a lot of people in the West were very excited about this idea. They had been hoping that Christianity would take hold in China, and the idea of a Christian emperor leading a Christian rebellion, coming in and starting a new government sounded great, sounded wonderful. And there was an effort by Westerners to make contact with the Hong Xiuquan and the Taiping. And this is where we get to this kind of issue, right? So basically, I think if you were to say to someone, let's say you're a Christian, and you were to say, okay, Christianity is coming into China. Should Christianity make itself fit into China? I think most Christians would say, well, yeah, of course, right? Chinese people, they live in a particular culture in a particular time. It makes sense that Christianity is going to have a Chinese expression. Right? I think that's fairly a non-controversial statement. I think most Christians would say, yeah, that's how it should work. The issue is, well, at what point do you say, though, this is no longer Christianity? And I'm not trying to make a judgment call here. I'm trying to say, from the perspective of the people, the missionaries, of the Christians working in China, how far can this go? This is a question they have to answer. And we can see the difficulties here. Because what happens is a group of British soldiers and sailors, of course, most of them are Christian. None of them are theologically trained, but they're people who've been raised in a Christian culture, who are familiar with basic doctrines of Christianity. Some of them are more devout and have gone to Sunday school and things like that. And when they do make contact with the Taiping, and again, I have to be careful here because, like I say, if this was my China class, we'd be spending a lot of time on this. The Taiping is the name of the rebellion, right? And Taiping literally means heavenly peace, and they're trying to build the kingdom of heavenly peace, which sounds a lot like the kingdom of God. That's what they're going for here. So the Taiping rebellion is and the Taiping is this group of religious followers of Hong Xiuquan, this guy who thinks he's the second son of Jesus. So hopefully that makes sense. So this group of Western Christians is going to make contact. None of these guys are missionaries. I want to stress they're soldiers and sailors with basic theological training, and they make contact with the Taiping, with Hong Xiuquan's followers. And it looks like things are going to be really nice because Hong Xiuquan's followers say, hey, this is great. You are Christians. You are from countries that have been Christian for a long time. We have some questions for you that we're having trouble answering. All right. We're Christians too, but we've been reading the Bible and we've got some questions. Can you help us answer them? And I'm sure, again, if you're a Christian, you're going to be happy if someone asks you this question. I agree with you, but there's some stuff I have trouble with in the Bible. Please help me. The Bible doesn't seem to answer these questions. Please tell me what the answers are. So you ready? Ready to answer these questions? All right. How tall is God? What color is his beard? What sorts of clothes does he wear? Was Jesus' first wife our elder sister? How many sons and grandsons does God have? So I think, again, if you were in this hypothetical position as a Christian, you would be kind of confused because these aren't questions that maybe you think of asking when you read the Bible, right? These are a bit different, right? And you almost would say, why are you asking these questions? Is this really important, right? If you're a Western Christian, you may even say, why is this even important? I'm not trying to say it's not important, but my point here is that it shows a difference in priorities that people might have, right? In Chinese traditional religion and philosophy, it's hard to think of something as being purely spiritual. And the other world, the world outside the world we live in, is often understood as kind of a mirror of our world. So we have wives and kids here. It makes sense that the same thing would happen in the next world as well. So my point here is not to make fun of the Taiping, but to show how difficult this is, this kind of question. You bring Christianity to a new culture, and then you probably say, yeah, the people in that culture, they need to be able to adjust it to kind of fit with their context. Does it cease becoming Christianity if you think that God has multiple sons? How do you understand that? How do you explain it? This gets tricky. So again, so what happens is there's going to be this Western rejection of the Taiping, Western Christian rejection. Part of it, as you can see here, these guys are talking about the massacres the Taiping were engaging in. Remember, they thought the Manchus were like literal demons, so they were going around killing Manchus left and right, even if they surrendered. But again, it's hard if you're a Western Christian to accept someone saying, well, I'm another son of God equal to Jesus. I mean, Jesus is kind of above me because he's my older brother, but I'm still way above you because I'm like literally the younger brother of Jesus. And I mean that like in an almost biological way, right? So it gets tricky. And so what's going to happen is the Western Christians will say to the Taiping, well, a lot of this stuff you're just wrong about, and you're certainly not the younger brother of Jesus. Right? Now, God does talk about us becoming his sons, but that's not the same thing. And so what happens then, and the Westerners will say, look, here's some things in the Bible that show you're wrong. So this is where things get very interesting, because what happens is Hong Xiuquan will say, well, when what I think conflicts with the Bible, that must be because the Bible is corrupted. So what he does is he'll say, well, I had my vision, I had my experiences. I know those are true. So if the Bible doesn't support those, that means that you Westerners, you corrupted your Bible or some corruptions got in. So he started rewriting the Bible, right? He literally went through and rewrote the Bible. And to give you some examples of how he rewrites the Bible, in Genesis 9:20-25, basically what happens is Noah gets drunk and passes out, and his sons see him naked. And this is very upsetting to Hong Xiuquan, who even though he rejected Confucius, still had a kind of Confucian morality, thought that was terrible. That could not be in the Bible. That must be a corruption. So he just totally revised it. And then he changes the Matthew 22:24-26 kind of conversation between Jesus and the Sadducees. And I'm just going to give you the quote here. The oldest one married and then died without children. So his brother married the widow, but the second brother also died, and the third brother too. This continued with all 7 of them. So in the Hebrew scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, there was this belief that if you, basically if your brother died without children, you should marry his wife and then have children for him posthumously. And I think also in a sense you're having children for her because it would be their job to take care of her when she got old. And the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And so what they're saying is that you had this situation where this woman married these 7 brothers, and they say in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Right? Which of the 7 brothers will she be? And Jesus says, you don't understand, in the resurrection, people aren't married anymore. They live like angels and so forth. But for our purposes here, to Hong Xiuquan, this seemed like incest, right? This seemed terrible because in Chinese custom, when you marry into a family, you become like a biological brother or sister, essentially. So the idea, this seemed like incest. So he said, this can't be right. So he changed brothers to another man, right? So he's revising the Bible. So again, this brings up this question, how Christian is this movement? Right. And this is, I'm not trying to say I'm not saying let's come to a decision here. That's not my point. But the point here is this: there is this tension between saying we want this, in order for Christianity to survive in China, it has to become Chinese. And Chinese people have to have a say in what Chinese Christianity looks like. But at the same time, if you don't have any guardrails, it can become something that is unrecognizable to Western Christians, which is essentially what happens. Now, I won't go too much in the history here, but what ends up happening is that the Western countries say, let's just work with the old government. They make a second Opium War treaty that gives them even more power in China, more ability to spread their form of Christianity, and they're not going to support the Taiping. No Western support equals military defeats. And this war, this rebellion, kills about 20 million people without solving anything. It's really, really terrible, causes a lot of damage. And for many Chinese people, this is what's also important to understand, they don't see how this is any different from just regular Christianity, if that makes sense, from standard or Western Christianity. They just look at this and say, wow, Christianity's really bad. The Christians came in, spread their ideas. It led to a rebellion that killed 20 million people. Now, I don't want to blame Christianity completely for this. There was a lot of other things that were going on, right? There were also ethnic issues here. There was issue with the foreign dynasty. There were a lot of problems here. It's important to remember Christianity had been in China for over 200 years and nothing like this had happened until this time. So I don't think it's fair to completely blame Christianity for this. But the key thing here is, from many Chinese people's perspective at the time, that's what's important for our purposes, this Christianity stuff is dangerous. It's a threat. It causes social disorder. We don't want it here.